Hey everyone, my name is Lizzie and today we'll be talking about what to do when your fermentation stops. So we have two options here. We have either it started off all fine and dandy and then after a few days it just stops. There's no more bubbles, the yeast stops eating the sugar, so that's option one, or it just never began from the beginning. In this case, it never began. So I was ready to give up on this and I will let you know all the steps that I do. So from beginning to end, what's the first thing I do when my alcohol is not bubbling, and does it always bubble at the end? The answer is yes. So this wash, I will show it to you here. This is what it looks like. So we see that it's not filled to the top. It's about 4/5 full. And my typical batches are usually full. This one, how I noticed that it wasn't functioning or it wasn't fermenting as I would like it, is that I did not see any foam on the liquid on day one. And from past experience, I could tell that sometimes your fermentation does not kick off right away. It could take 1, 2, 3 days for the yeast to become comfortable in its environment and then eat the sugar that's present. And once the sugar is eaten, then it produces CO2. CO2, once you have a jar with an airlock, is going to show through the airlock. So this little airlock here with the red cap is where the CO2 would be visible. And how is it visible? Because once there's CO2, you'll see bubbles in this airlock, and that means that the fermentation is working. So I did not see any bubbles. And the first thing to do is to make sure that the lid is tight. The lid meaning the white cap here. So you want to make sure it's tight, because if it's not tight, the air is going to come out of the lid and not from the airlock on top. So my first way to troubleshoot it is to remove the lid and to screw it up tight. However, this time I couldn't even unscrew the lid because it was so tightly placed. Therefore, I knew that it wasn't the lid the problem. It was tight, and if ever there was CO2 coming out, it would come out from the top and the airlock. However, I didn't see that. So my first option is, okay, maybe the yeast is dormant, maybe it's too cold. So I put it in a room and I blast the heat up to the maximum, and I usually leave it there overnight or at least a few hours. After the first day, no bubbling. Therefore, I left it there a second day. There was still no bubbling, and in my opinion, I thought there is something wrong with the yeast. And there is such thing as pitching in unfavorable yeast or damaged yeast. However, I take it from a package. I do not reuse my yeast. I use the EC 1118 yeast, and I rip it open. I use half the yeast for one batch and another half for the next batch. And if you want specific instructions on how to make your alcohol, there's a link in the description below. You can book a class and we'll guide you to make alcohol from A to Z. So I put my yeast in and I thought that it was too hot. Once you put your sugar inside your water and you dissolve it by stirring in the heat, you want to make sure that your liquid cools off before adding the yeast. Because when you look at the backside of your yeast package, there's an optimal temperature for the yeast to ferment at. And for the EC 1118, the optimal temperature is 35 to 37 degrees Celsius. If you use a different type of yeast, let's say distiller's yeast, it could be roughly around 26 degrees Celsius, depending on what you use. Turbo yeast, if you want to make your alcohol quick, you have different temperatures based on your yeast. And in this case, I did not wait for the liquid to cool off. As soon as the sugar was dissolved, I put it in a fermenting jar and directly put in the yeast. So I thought this killed off the yeast, and that's why it was not bubbling. And once I tried the lid, so I tried to tighten it up, that wasn't the problem. I put the liquid into a hot room. It still wasn't bubbling, therefore it wasn't the problem. I stirred it up with the spoon to make sure that the yeast is just living in its environment, eating all the potential sugar that's available, and it still was not bubbling. Therefore, everyone in this household shook the jar and made sure that the yeast was well hydrated and that all the sugar were present in its vicinity. And just to let you know that it took a lot of shaking for the yeast to finally start eating the sugar. And in my opinion, it's possible that it was eating it, however, we didn't notice because there was less bubbles present and there was no foam. However, this does not mean that your yeast is not eating the sugar. It's just that the bubbles are more subtle. If there's a lot of bubbles and a lot of yeast eating a lot of sugar at the same time, you will see a foam at the top of your liquid. However, you'll see as your fermentation goes by, the foam disappears because the fermentation is slower. And that's what happened in this case. The fermentation was slower, so the yeast was eating the sugar, but not at the rate that was fast enough to see bubbles. Now I can say that after shaking the jar, after stirring the yeast, after putting it in a warm environment, I made everything I could to put the yeast in a favorable environment. And we finally now see bubbles in the airlock. Therefore, the fermentation is working well. However, to be honest, if it still was not showing, I was ready to give up on this wash. The last thing I would have done was to put yeast inside a container with warm water and sugar to activate the yeast. And once the yeast would be activated, then I would dump it inside the jar. However, if you add too much yeast, this will affect your flavor and you do not want to add too much yeast. Just half of a small package would do, or you can add 1 teaspoon of yeast for
5 liters or 1 gallon.
If you're making 5 gallons, you can add 1 whole package of yeast or 2 teaspoons. So I can say now that the wash is working. However, one of the reasons for which the airlock wasn't bubbling at the beginning because the wash is not full. So once there's bubbles, since it only arrives at roughly 4/5 of the jar, it's possible that the CO2 that's being produced is not strong enough to fill up all that void and reach the airlock. So I can confirm that even if there's no bubbles in the airlock, that fermentation is working and that there's bubbles within the wash. And usually what we do, we fill it up to the top. However, this time, based on the recipe, we only filled it to a portion of the jar. I'll show you a jar that is full. This is a little heavier. We used grape juice for this. And if you like to see how I made wine from grape juice, you can look at the link here. And I can't wait to taste this to let you know, does it actually taste like wine? Does it taste more of a low class wine? Because we didn't use crushed grapes, so we used grape juice from the store. So that's coming up in one of these videos. And let me know, what's your favorite ingredient to make your alcohol? Do you use juice boxes? Do you use water and sugar? I'm curious to know. And if you found this video valuable, share with a friend and don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.